Hi, this is Mark Pravonic back for another session of Thinking in a Garage and Drinking Beer. Last week, I introduced the Thomas Jefferson Golden Ale to you, made by Yard's Brewery. And as I mentioned, they have three different ales of the Revolution. Besides the Jefferson Ale, they have the Poor Richard Spruce Ale, which I just poured today, and then also the Washington Porter. The Franklin Ale, and what makes these, well, not just the Franklin Ale, but what makes all these ales somewhat unique is the flavor because of the ingredients that they use in them. So, for instance, the Franklin Ale uses organic spruce tips, barley, and molasses. And the nice thing about this ale, it's actually quite refreshing ale. I'm not sure if I would quite call it a summer ale. You probably have one, maybe two on a summer evening. The ABV on this is not very high. It's a little over 5%. But obviously a really good ale to have at Christmas time. And the nice thing about it, it does not taste like you're drinking from the bowl, under the water bowl underneath the Christmas tree. And then, like I said last week, I introduced the Jefferson Golden Ale, but I failed to mention the ingredients in this particular beer. And so the Jefferson Golden Ale is made with flaked oats and maize, rye and wheat, and honey. But anyway, we're talking about Ben Franklin today. And Franklin, of course, was another one of those founders who was a very deep thinker. A man with the women. He would not go well with the Me Too movement today. But Franklin was very insightful. And he was particularly insightful when it came to things like finance. And so he had many quotes concerning to be frugal, to save money, and not to go into debt. And one of those quotes that Franklin came out with was that he'd rather go to bed without dinner than to rise in debt. And so Franklin wasn't talking about people starving to death, necessary to live or to save money, that you have to take care of your needs. But he was certainly saying that it's better to go without something you can't afford. And the thought process is debt does not create wealth, it destroys it. So this past week, in a redo of the years leading up to 2007-2009 financial crisis, where this idea of building wealth comes with home ownership and government guarantees on mortgages, we certainly know how that ended up. It nearly destroyed the entire economy. But as I said, in a redo of those years, Kamala Harris, presidential candidate and senator from California, a couple days ago came out with a home ownership plan that she believes will help black families create wealth. And so her plan calls for the federal government to give up to $25,000 to 4 million black families that they can use for down payments and closing costs on a house. So what I want to do is go through a little math, a little basic finance, and to see why this plan has many holes in it, and also the holes in or the flaws in thinking that home ownership by itself can create wealth. So let's suppose you take the $25,000 and you're going to use $20,000 for a down payment on a purchase of a $250,000 house, and then you're going to have probably somewhere around $5,000 or maybe a little more in closing costs to purchase that house. So the monthly payments on a 30-year mortgage, assuming a 4% interest rate on a $230,000 loan, is going to be approximately $1,472, and that not only includes principal and interest, it includes insurance, it includes PMI, and it includes taxes. Now, for all of us that have owned houses, we know that houses aren't cheap. They just don't sit there. They don't repair themselves, and there's always maintenance that needs to be done on the property. So most people say, well, you can figure around 1% a year in maintenance cost, or 1% of the house purchase price in maintenance cost. So if you're buying a $250,000 house, you're going to have annual maintenance costs of around $2,500. But the big thing is you're not really purchasing a $250,000 house because by the time 30 years is over and you include all those interest payments onto the principal, the actual house that you're going to buy comes to $415,299. In other words, the house has to appreciate 66% over that time to just break even. So home ownership, just for the sake of home ownership, is not necessarily a wealth building method. And as we saw in 2007, 2009, and as we saw to the years leading up to the Great Depression, and as we've seen in Japan, real estate isn't one of those assets that continually goes up. There are moments when they do crash. So anyway, unless you pay cash or you take out something like a 15-year mortgage or the property produces income, your chance of truly building wealth are slim, and Slim has his bags packed and ready to go. The important thing to remember here is money by itself does not build wealth. What builds wealth? Sound financial habits and savings do. And there's examples where people have had money fall into their laps, great amounts of money, and yet you see them years later broke and rags into the streets. And so anyway, take a look at some of these statistics. Lottery winners are more likely to declare bankruptcy within 5 years than the average American. We know that 33% of all lottery winners eventually go bankrupt. 60% of NBA players are broke within 5 years of retirement. And even worse, 78% of NFL players face financial distress within 2 years of retirement. Again, wealth is a behavior. It's behavior that builds wealth. It's not just money in your lap. And so we must take a look that what Harris's program, and it's a $100 billion program, intends to do is somehow to catch black families up in a so-called wealth gap. But what isn't addressed is what makes, and particularly into the black community, why is there maybe a disproportionate of poor? Well, we know what causes poor, or at least we know some of the precursors of poor. It's a lack of education, lack of experience. And we also know that families that are headed by a single parent, mostly female, that the children are going to grow up in poverty. That's more likely to have a continued generation of poverty when households are just headed by a female in particular. So what are some of the stats on the black poor? Well, nearly 2/3 of black families are headed by a single parent, mostly female. 75% of black children are born out of wedlock. 35% of single mother homes, as I've said, live in poverty. So the potential adverse effects on children of growing up in a single mother, a single family home headed by a mother, is that they are less likely to graduate from high school. They've been shown to have slower emotional and social developments, and more likely they are to become teenage parents themselves. So the ideal that this is going to be some magic pill to help increase black wealth is just pure fantasy. We know that from history. But not only that, but there's some economic consequences that are not seen in this plan. And one of the things that we know is that government subsidies, anytime you subsidize something, especially a product, what ends up happening is the subsidization drives demand up, and with increased demand, also prices go up. And we've seen this. We saw it in Obamacare. You know, Obamacare with its subsidies was supposed to reduce health insurance premiums for middle-class families. Instead, it has driven them up by hundreds of percent. We also know that we've seen this in colleges, that subsidized college loans. It increases the demand for college and thus drives up the cost of tuition many times over. So what we do know, or what we can speculate what would happen with this plan is that the new buyers looking for a house are not going to be finding a $250,000 house. They may be finding a $400,000 house. And so the so-called affordability goes out the window. And then what happens is they get into a house more than that they can afford, with the promise that somehow this is going to create wealth. And what ends up happening is they fail to make the payments, they fall behind, and now are forced to sell a house. And just like we saw in 2007 and 2009, all of a sudden you have this avalanche of houses coming onto the market without any buyers for them. And not only does the person not get the expected wealth increases, but they actually end up with far less money than what they originally purchased the house and for what the loan is for. So if we're really concerned about solving this problem of the income disparity, especially that we see within black families, I think we have to start off with a very frank talk, and that is that what needs to be done is to promote mother and father family units. We know, as we said before, kids that come from a two-parent family have a certain advantages over the single-parent family. And instead of spending $100 billion on down payments and closing costs, I would suggest that we could spend far less and purchase maybe the Dave Ramsey course on financial disciplines. I mean, that course costs maybe $129, so far less expensive than the $25,000. But the one thing we do know also is that this is not really a financial plan. This is not a wealth building plan. What Kamala Harris is really talking about is just in another series of race pandering. And we know over the past 5 decades, race pandering has not made black families better off. And if you need proof of it, I would suggest that you take a good drive down through the inner cities and see the absolute destruction of the human spirit that giveaway programs have caused. So anyway, that's about it for me. Short session today. Glad to finish off my beer before heading to the golf course for a little practice. So, well, until the next time in the garage, cheers, everyone. Have a good afternoon.